May 7, 2001, 7:32 in the morning, Lipetsk, Petropavlovsky Market. A customer stands at the entrance waiting for Lyudmila Fomina. He's been selling chandeliers and wallpaper here for 42 years, knows every other vendor by name. The day before, they'd made an arrangement. Lyudmila would bring sausage at wholesale price. She always kept her word, showed up right on time, ran her affairs with precision. 3 marriages behind her, the market every single day, not a single shift missed. She didn't come. That morning, 14-year-old Victoria Yershova, stepdaughter of Lyudmila's husband Alexei Fomin, should have been at school. She wasn't there. The apartment on Pobedy Avenue, where the 3 of them lived as a family, was locked. The phone went unanswered. With the May holidays still going on, the neighbors figured they'd gone to the dacha. A day passes, then a second, then a third. The customer chalks up the delay to a trip. Market acquaintances call each other. Nobody knows anything. Alexei Fomin shows up at the police station and files a report. His wife and stepdaughter are missing. He's worried, says he's visited relatives, called everyone he knows, driven out to nearby villages. The police accept the report and begin their check. 24 years later, the Oktyabrski District Court of Lipetsk would establish that by the time the customer was waiting at the market, both of them were already gone. Their remains would never be found, not in 2001, and not 20 years later. And the one responsible for what happened to them spent all those years living in a neighboring city, raising a new son, and acting as if nothing had ever happened. To understand how 2 people vanished from an apartment without a trace, we need to go back one day. The timeline all added up, except for one small detail. Igor Churilov, Lyudmila's son from her first marriage, never made it inside that night. A typical May 6th evening, a holiday, a day off, a few beers. He decided to drop by his mother's place. He knocks on the door. From behind it, a voice tells him, "Come back tomorrow." He shrugs and leaves. He'd long gotten used to the oddities of this family. He knew things between his mother and Fomin were falling apart at the seams. Lyudmila had been confiding to her closest friend that her husband was cheating. She'd lost a lot of weight from the stress in recent weeks. She said something her friend would remember word for word. "Our marriage is over. Olga is going to tear us apart." Fomin's sister had been openly pushing her brother toward a breakup. The conflict had been building for months. Lyudmila had excluded Fomin from the privatization of the apartment, their only home. He lost any claim to the property, left with nothing but a paper registration. Effectively a tenant with no rights in a home that legally belonged to his wife. At the same time, Lyudmila had been hiding from Fomin's parents the fact that she had an adult son, Igor. On the outside, a family, a stepdaughter. On the inside, 2 people on the brink of collapse. Victoria kept a personal diary. She wrote down the fights between her mother and stepfather, the shouting, the accusations, the slamming doors. She documented what the adults preferred to ignore. That diary would later be seized during the apartment inspection. It would become one of the key pieces of evidence documenting the escalating conflict. Igor went home that night without suspecting anything serious. His stepfather's infidelity was one thing. The idea that Fomin was capable of something else entirely didn't even cross his mind. Behind that closed door, by that point, something had already happened that ended the lives of 2 people. There was a table in the kitchen. Ordinary, a family table with detachable screw-on legs. Wooden, with a metal rod at the tip. Fomin had been living in this apartment for years and knew its construction by heart. He used that table leg to strike Lyudmila at least 3 times. She sustained fatal injuries. Lyudmila did not survive. Victoria happened to be nearby and witnessed what was happening. Fomin struck her with the same object at least twice. She did not survive either. That very same table had appeared in every family photograph. Gatherings, holidays, ordinary dinners. The linoleum and the concrete floor beneath it absorbed the evidence left behind that night, and there was a significant amount of it. Not a trace remained visible on the surface. On the night of May 6th to 7th, Fomin wrapped both of them in bedsheets, loaded them into his car, drove along the Lipetsk-Usman highway toward the settlement of Traktorostroitly. He stopped near a tree line, dug a pit, and buried them. He returned before dawn. Starting May 7th, Lyudmila was expected at the market, Victoria at school. The customer stood at the entrance, not understanding the delay. Fomin at that time was home alone. The apartment looked normal, except for the stains on the floor that he hadn't yet managed to conceal. Over the next 5 days, he constructed a cover story for their disappearance, step by step, methodically, like a man who knew that one slip in the details and everything would fall apart. And so Fomin set his performance in motion. The wallpaper, he tore it off in the kitchen and hallway, ripping it halfway down the walls, simulating a renovation that hadn't existed before that date. Neighbors and acquaintances would later confirm, before Lyudmila and Victoria disappeared, the wallpaper was intact. No renovation had been planned. The tearing happened between May 9th and 10th, after the apartment had already been emptied. Alongside the so-called renovation, Fomin dismantled his stepdaughter's room, sold the furniture, the wardrobe, the shelves, and gave away Lyudmila and Victoria's personal belongings. He scrubbed the apartment of any trace of their existence, as if they had never lived there. The table with the detachable legs, the one that appeared in every family photograph, vanished without a trace. On May 10th, Fomin drove to the village of Plastinki, supposedly to look for his wife and stepdaughter. He called mutual acquaintances, asked questions, appeared nervous, asked them to call back if they learned anything. He was creating the image of a husband in a panic. In reality, Fomin was destroying evidence. The torn-off wallpaper concealed dark stains on the walls, left behind from the evening of May 6th. The sold furniture and distributed belongings removed any reminder of those who were already gone. And the trip to Plastinki created an alibi, the caring husband who was first to sound the alarm. Fomin did something the guilty usually avoid. He went to the police himself. He walked into the station and placed a report on the desk. His story was rehearsed. Lyudmila had left with some acquaintance from Petrovsky Market and taken Victoria to a friend's place in Plastinki. Who this acquaintance was, he couldn't specify. He couldn't give a name, just said the man had a car. The make, the color, the plate number, he couldn't remember. They questioned him, and already during the first interview, Fomin started getting confused. First, they left with a bag, then he corrected himself. No, with plastic bags. He specified that Lyudmila left on her own, but then changed the route. The details kept shifting. Each new phrasing slightly contradicted the last. The investigators logged the report and began working through the possible scenarios. First, debts. Lyudmila, according to acquaintances, owed approximately $1,700. By 2001 standards, a significant sum, but manageable for a market vendor. Second, abduction. One of her creditors could have taken both of them. Third, flight. Lyudmila had allegedly been planning a trip to Poland with merchandise and could have left in a hurry. Each theory looked plausible, and each one led the investigation further away from the apartment where everything had actually happened. Detectives fanned out across addresses, creditors, market connections, possible routes. Fomin outwardly behaved as expected, worried, cooperative, answering questions. To anyone watching, a grief-stricken husband who couldn't understand what had happened to his family. But even then, the apartment held evidence that contradicted every single one of those theories. They simply didn't get around to reading it, or didn't want to. Lyudmila's international passport was sitting in a dresser drawer. The Poland trip theory fell apart immediately. You don't cross international borders without documents. Victoria's watch, the one she never left the house without, was sitting on a shelf. Both of their warm clothes, jackets, were hanging in the closet. Nobody leaving for an extended trip in May leaves their outerwear behind. A separate detail, a school trip to St. Petersburg had been paid for. The money had been turned in among the very first. She'd been looking forward to that trip. Someone who had been saving up for St. Petersburg and counting down the days wouldn't have left voluntarily 2 weeks before it. The apartment inspection revealed more. On the kitchen linoleum, traces that ordinary household dirt doesn't leave behind. On the concrete floor beneath it, the same thing, soaked in deep. A torn piece of wallpaper with dark stains was seized as physical evidence and sent for storage. Every finding pointed to one conclusion: no one left that apartment. They vanished from it, without documents, without belongings, without a watch, without plans. The investigation logged everything into the official record. The torn wallpaper was packaged, the passport was photographed. But the conclusion all of this pointed to was never drawn. It was all right there on the surface. They either couldn't or wouldn't connect the dots. Later, in 2001, Fomin was called in for a second interview. The second one within a month. Again, he got confused, changed his phrasing, stumbled over himself, gave different details about his wife's departure. The investigator noted the contradictions in the record, but things never went beyond the interview. No search of the apartment, no forensic examination of the traces on the floor, no inspection of his car. 2 interviews in 2 months, and that was it. No confrontation hearing, no cross-examination, no phone records pulled. He remained classified as a witness. Formally, the aggrieved party, the husband who filed the report. The family conflict was noted, but filed as a domestic matter. Lyudmila's financial problems, the debts, the market, the third marriage, seemed like a more plausible motive for running away than for anything else. Victoria's diary, seized from the apartment, contained entries about fights, shouting, accusations, tension. But in 2001, those pages apparently didn't become the deciding factor. Domestic conflicts aren't uncommon, and the case was suspended. No suspect, no progress. The file went into the archive. Fomin walked away from this story clean. A witness who helped the investigation, drove around looking for his wife, called acquaintances, not a single charge. For the next 19 years, he lived as though nothing had happened. Fomin left Lipetsk, new address, the city of Vidnoye, Moscow region. A different region, different people, a different life. He got a job, rented a place, started from scratch. He found a new wife. A son was born. Fomin became a father, a husband, an ordinary resident of a suburban neighborhood. No one around him knew that his previous wife had disappeared along with his stepdaughter. Nobody asked why he'd moved. To neighbors and co-workers, just Alexei, family man, nothing remarkable. Morning, work, home. Years went by, and the distance between Fomin and that evening on Pobedi Avenue grew with every passing month. He didn't change his last name, didn't hide. He lived openly under his real name, with a real registered address. In Lipetsk, meanwhile, the case lay dead. Not a single new investigative action. The file gathered dust in the archive. Lyudmila and Victoria's relatives lived without answers. Lyudmila's mother waited for any news at all. Her son Igor remembered that evening, May 6th, the locked door. The voice from behind it, telling him to come back tomorrow. He'd walk past the apartment on Pobedi Avenue, which now stood empty. Years turned into decades. Victoria would have turned 20, then 25, then 30. The trip to St. Petersburg she'd been so excited about had long since become just a line in a school register. 19 years, an entire lifetime, and someone at the investigative committee still hadn't forgotten. A suspended criminal case, a legal limbo. Not closed. You can't put a period on it, but not being worked either. No suspect, no new information, no grounds for active measures. Cases like these are called cold cases. They sit for years, sometimes decades. This case had a particular feature that made it nearly hopeless. The location where the remains were presumably hidden. The tree line near the settlement of Traktorostroitly had changed beyond recognition over 20 years. Trenches had been dug there, utility lines laid, earth torn up. The landscape had been turned over multiple times. Even if someone pointed to the exact spot, finding anything would be virtually impossible. The object used, the table leg with the metal rod, had vanished along with the table back in 2001. No physical evidence of the act remained. Zero direct evidence. The torn wallpaper with dark stains was formally listed in storage. A legal dead end. No instrument, no remains, no suspect. The case existed only on paper, a gray folder in the archive. But in 2020, the investigative committee launched a program to review unsolved cases. An analytical team pulled the folder off the shelf and began reading it from scratch. The investigation into the disappearance of Lyudmila Fomina and Victoria Yershova was reopened. The analytical team received the case file and read the materials from page 1. A fresh set of eyes changed everything. The 2001 records now read like an indictment. The contradictions in Fomin's statements formed a pattern. The wallpaper renovation 3 days after the disappearance. Not a household chore, but the destruction of evidence. The sold furniture from the stepdaughter's room, not a move, but a cleanup. The vanished table, not a replacement for an old one, but the disposal of the instrument. The passport at home, the watch on the shelf, the paid-for trip to St. Petersburg. Everything pointed to one thing. No one left that apartment voluntarily. The analysts built a profile. The only person in the apartment on the evening of May 6th, Fomin. The only one who changed his story. The only one with a motive. The apartment from which he'd been cut out during privatization. A marriage on the verge of collapse. A wife who openly discussed divorce. Fomin was located in Vidnoye, 19 years under his own name, out in the open, working, raising a son. He was summoned for questioning as a suspect for the first time in the entire history of the case. He came in, sat down across from the table with the folder of case materials, and did something no one expected. He started talking. He gave a full confession on camera, on the record, in the presence of an attorney. He described the evening of May 6th in a way that only someone who had been inside the apartment could have. He named the table leg with the metal tip. He stated the number of strikes. He explained why his stepdaughter became a victim. She saw what happened to her mother. He described how he wrapped both of them in sheets, how he loaded them into the car, how he drove along the highway at night, how he dug near the tree line. Details came one after another, precise, specific, without pauses, and each one matched the evidence. The traces on the kitchen floor, the torn wallpaper, the missing table. Fomin knew things no outsider could have known. The layout of the rooms, the type of flooring, the construction of the table, the route he took. After the interrogation, a polygraph. The results aligned with his account of the final moments. The polygraph readings matched the confession on every key point. The investigative team went to the site, the tree line near the settlement of Traktorostroitli. Fomin pointed out the area. Excavations began. They dug for 1 day, then a second. But over 20 years, earthworks had been conducted there. No remains were found. The case that had been stalled for 20 years received more from a single interrogation than from all previous investigations combined. A video confession, polygraph confirmation. It seemed like the case was finally closed. But Fomin changed his mind. He recanted all of his statements entirely, claiming he had falsely incriminated himself under pressure from investigators. His version: they drove him around the city for 8 hours, gave him nothing to drink, nothing to eat, put a bag over his head. He claimed he signed the record in a state where he would have signed anything, and demanded the interrogation be declared unlawful. His attorney backed the position. Testimony obtained in violation of procedure. The investigative committee conducted an internal review. They examined Fomin. Not a scratch, not a bruise, not a single trace of physical force. They pulled up the video recording of the interrogation. Fomin spoke calmly, coherently, with no signs of distress. He answered questions and volunteered details the investigator hadn't even asked about. A forensic psychologist assessed the behavior, consistent with voluntary testimony. No signs of coercion detected. Legally, recanting testimony is a defendant's right. Fomin exercised it. The confession given in September formally ceased to be in effect. Now the investigation was left with a video recording disavowed by its author, polygraph results the court had no obligation to accept, and a set of circumstantial evidence 20 years old. No remains, no instrument, no standing confession. The prosecution was built on a single foundation. Fomin, on the recording, cited details that only someone who was in the apartment that evening could have known. The question was stark. Would this be enough for a conviction? 2021. Fomin's case went to trial. The prosecution laid out everything they had. Circumstantial evidence 20 years old. The video recording, the confession, polygraph results, witness testimony, neighbors' statements, the sale of furniture. The chain was built on the totality, each fact individually explainable, but together they all pointed to a single conclusion. The defense worked from the opposite angle: remains not found. The fact that anyone had perished was not proven. The instrument had vanished. Forensic examination impossible. The confession was recanted. The attorneys methodically dismantled each element of the prosecution's case. No direct evidence. The court reached a decision that shocked both sides. The judge excluded the episode involving Victoria, ruling it an act not attributable to the defendant. Only Lyudmila's case remained. June 2022, a sentence of 10 years. The prosecution had seemingly achieved a result, but Fomin didn't go to prison. The judge immediately applied a mechanism that nullified everything. 21 years had passed between the crime and the verdict. For serious offenses, the law allows 15. The time had expired. 10 years on paper and 0 days behind bars. 21 years of investigation, and he walked home again. The mechanism that saved Fomin works, simply. For serious offenses, the law sets a 15-year window from the moment of commission. If the guilty party isn't convicted within that time, liability is lifted. Fomin did what he did in 2001. The verdict came in 2022. 21 years. 6 beyond the limit. The critical question: did he evade the investigation? But Fomin had lived openly. Real name, real registered address, a job, a family. He didn't change his documents, didn't hide, didn't leave the country. He paid taxes, enrolled his son in daycare, received his salary by direct deposit. Formally available for any investigative action at any time. The court ruled he did not evade, which meant the statute of limitations ran continuously. This meant one thing: time had been working in Fomin's favor from the very beginning. Every year without investigative action was another year in his favor. Every day the folder sat in the archive brought closer the moment when the law would stand in his defense, and that moment had arrived long before the case was ever pulled from the shelf. For Lyudmila and Victoria's relatives, this was a devastating blow. The court found him guilty and immediately released him, a finding of guilt without punishment. The prosecution left the courtroom with a single intention: to appeal. They filed an appeal. The main argument: the trial court made an error by excluding the episode involving Victoria. If the charges involving both victims were reinstated, it changes everything. 2 victims, no longer just a serious crime, but an especially grave one. For especially grave crimes, the law provides a different mechanism. The court has the right to refuse to apply the statute of limitations. It's not obligated to, but it has the right. The second trial. A new judge studied the materials, heard both sides. The prosecution insisted Victoria was not an incidental victim, but a witness who was deliberately eliminated. The defense objected: insufficient evidence of intent. Changing the classification based on the same materials was legally unsound. The defense maintained that evidence of intent was insufficient. The first court had justifiably excluded this episode. Reclassifying the charges based on the same case file had no legal standing. The result, again, in Fomin's favor. The judge dismissed the case due to the expiration of the statute of limitations. The defendant had not evaded. The deadlines had passed. The prosecution appealed again. This time, a cassation appeal. The petition went to Saratov, to the First Cassation Court of General Jurisdiction, the last court that could turn the case around. If it refused, Fomin would be free, definitively. 24 years for nothing. The case went to cassation, and came back completely different. The First Cassation Court of General Jurisdiction accepted the case. The prosecution rebuilt its arguments from scratch. The statute of limitations had been applied automatically, whereas the judge could have refused to apply it given the nature of the crime committed. The central argument: Victoria didn't become a victim by accident. She was in the apartment and saw what happened to her mother. Fomin eliminated a witness deliberately, not a coincidence. If the charges include both victims, the crime moves into the category of especially grave offenses, where the court is obligated to individually assess the question of limitations. For the first time in 24 years, the court reviewed the decisions of both lower courts, compared the legal classification against the actual circumstances, and issued its ruling. The cassation was granted, both previous decisions overturned. The case was sent back to Lipetsk for a new trial with the full charges, actions against two individuals, one committed with the purpose of concealing the other. Fomin, who had walked free twice, was once again placed on the defendant's bench. The third trial, Judge Olga Luzginova. Before her, two of her colleagues had presided over this case. Both had let the defendant go. Now the decision was hers. The third, and final, attempt by the system to see this case through. The judge started the proceedings from scratch. Full charges, actions against two individuals. The prosecution built its case link by link, element by element. First block, the apartment, traces on the kitchen floor, documented in 2001. The wallpaper torn off the walls days after the disappearance. The table with detachable legs, vanished without a trace. Furniture from the stepdaughter's room, sold. Personal belongings of both women, given away. Second block, Fomin's behavior, contradictions in his statements, a bag or plastic bags, the bus station or from the apartment, the demonstrative trip to Plastinki, the police report, the crafting of the concerned husband image, 3 layers of cover-up in 5 days. Third block, the video confession, details that only someone who had been in the apartment could have known. The construction of the table, the instrument used, the sequence of events, the method of disposal. Not a single one of these facts had appeared in any public source. Not a single one could have been fed to him by an investigator. Too specific. The defense countered, remains not found, instrument not recovered, confession recanted, no direct evidence. The court heard both sides, hearing after hearing. The trial stretched on for weeks. No single piece of evidence was a conviction in itself, but together they formed a picture with only one explanation. The piece of torn wallpaper with dark stains seized in 2001, packaged and labeled. When the case was reopened, the physical evidence had simply vanished from storage. Forensic testing was impossible. One of the few remaining physical traces had evaporated, the remains not found. The prosecution was banking on the video. A man who knows everything is the one who did it. The defense responded. The recording was obtained under duress. Everything else is speculation. Judge Luzginova was preparing to announce her decision. The defense attorneys expected an acquittal. 2 previous trials had ended in their client's favor. The prosecution wasn't certain of anything. Closing arguments. The prosecution requested the maximum possible sentence. The prosecutor listed 24 years since the crime was committed. 3 trials. 2 dismissals on statute of limitations grounds, a cassation that returned the case, and a single question, when? The prosecutor reminded the court of its right to refuse to apply the statute of limitations for especially grave crimes, emphasized that Fomin didn't simply commit one act, he eliminated a witness and enjoyed the result for 19 years. The defense spoke before the defendant's final statement. The evidence base, nothing but circumstantial. They invoked the presumption of innocence. They declared their readiness to appeal any guilty verdict, all the way to the Supreme Court. Fomin stood and delivered his final statement. Most likely, he repeated the defense's position. The confession was given under duress. He falsely incriminated himself. He was innocent. He spoke of his new family, his son, the life he'd built over these years. 24 years. Enough time to rehearse a story until it becomes automatic. He knew 2 courts had already sided with him. Luzginova closed the arguments and announced the date for the verdict. Fomin left the building on his own recognizance for the last time. The system had let him go twice. There might not be a third chance, not for the prosecution, and not for those who'd been waiting for answers. March 3, 2025. The courtroom of the Oktyabrski District Court of Lipetsk. Judge Olga Luzginova entered and began reading the verdict. Alexei Fomin stood behind the glass partition in the same courtroom he had walked out of twice as a free man. Guilty, on both counts, actions against 2 individuals. The second committed to conceal the first. The court refused to apply the statute of limitations. The nature and severity of the crime precluded release from liability. 11 years in a maximum security facility. Court officers approached Fomin right there in the courtroom. The click of handcuffs on his wrists, the first in 24 years. 3 trials, 2 dismissals, a cassation in Saratov, and now, metal on his hands. Fomin didn't leave through the main exit, but through a service corridor into a prison transport vehicle. A case built without remains, without the instrument, on a recanted confession, ended in a guilty verdict. Despite the absence of direct evidence, the defense attorneys announced their intention to appeal, but that evening, for the first time in 24 years, Fomin didn't come home. He didn't call his wife. He didn't tuck his son into bed. He spent the night in a cell, in the very same Lipetsk he had once left behind. Lyudmila and Victoria's remains were never found, but their story was finally heard. What do you think about this video? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe to our channel. See you next time.